Yes. Thank you all for being here. I'm really excited to have this conversation, laying the groundwork for a new space economy. This is a great mix. It's different technologies, but each is hopefully going to provide the building blocks of the next sort of space age. Kelly, I want to start with you. I was hoping you could sort of set the scene for us and maybe give an analogy for where the space industry is today. Are we like the internet in the 90s? Are we like the US highway system in the 50s? Does anything come to mind?
So you told me you were going to ask me this, and yet I'm still mulling over that question in my head. I think it's very dependent upon what aspect you're actually considering. And I know Max and I already started disagreeing with this in the back. Stoke, we like to think of it as a tall ships era, when we're really beginning to open lanes of transport and beginning the exploration part, and really opening up I would say, outer space as we build these new capabilities.
Mm-hmm.
Being from a government bent, with my background, I also think of it in terms of the type of investment that the government tends to put into various technologies. And so if you think about space, I think of it very similarly to what microelectronics was. Microelectronics, the government kind of spearheaded that. They put a significant amount of money into it.
They got the 80s.
Excuse me?
In the 80s, right?
Yes, in the
Around
80s,
yeah.
Exactly, yes. And it took off, and you saw these massive developments in CMOS technologies, some huge leaps and bounds, and commercial was just really driving the industry. And at some point in time, the aggregation of the foundries and the movement of those types of things offshore, and the lack of kind of focus from the government in those types of capabilities really started to lag behind in all the innovation and the investment they were putting into it. And so we saw a lot of our adversaries then at that point in time really pushing forward and doing a significant amount of innovation in that area, whereas the government in the US was really counting on commercial to kind of lead the way. And we kind of got, we kind of were a little bit of asleep. And so then we woke up, and DARPA did the ERI, and then we had the CHIPS Act, really bringing innovation and investment back into the U.S., and really the government playing a huge role in innovation in that particular area. And so with space, I see the government really trying to say, let's use commercial, firm fixed price, and really pushing in that direction with less kind of R&D, especially in some of the space kind of superiority aspects. And I almost am a little bit nervous that we're at that point where we really see, other nations and really playing a more dominant role.
Mm-hmm.
That was very long-winded, I apologize.
Well, it's an interesting answer because, like, the tall ships era, that's kind of an optimistic response that led to incredible exploration, wealth generation, technological development. And then, the microelectronics, it's a little bit, there's more of a cautionary tale there, maybe.
Yes.
You said backstage that you can't agree about the microelectronics. What were you thinking?
Well, the view is that, VAST is building space station, and we're right now at the cusp of the transition to commercial. So far, all space stations have been government programmed. The ISS is reputed to be the International Space Station, to be the world's most expensive object ever created by humans, single object, 155 billion. And we have the opportunity now, with the help of NASA and the government, to transition it to a commercial platform. So right now there's a contract called CLD Phase 2 that's about 1.5 billion to get going with the first demonstration, and the government wants to pick 2 or more winners. Now, we don't think they should pick 3 or 4, they should pick 2. But we definitely think, thanks to the advance of commercialization of crewed spacecraft with SpaceX that we can rely on, that is definitely a great start for us to save taxpayer money and then start building commercial space stations. So we could always have more government funding, but I also think that there's an adequate level in private industry as to start to step in, basically.
But is there any risk, to the point about the microelectronics, commercial industry takes over and maybe it doesn't go in the direction of, say, the national interest? Is there a risk there?
I mean, right now the program that we are part of is driven by national interests. We've had humans in space, the US and its allies, for 25 years, and only in the last few years, China is now a space station there. The ISS has to be retired at the end of the 20s in 2030. And so if we don't have a commercial alternative, we will basically cede low Earth orbit to China. So geopolitics and obviously these adversaries being in this war-fighting domain without us being there, it's not acceptable. And that's why the program exists. Now, we could do it the old way, which is another cost-plus contract and rebuild a new ISS, or we could do it the commercial way. And SpaceX showed the way for crewed spaceflight. If you all remember, we used to rely on the space shuttle, and NASA created a competition in 2008 and then later to compete Boeing and SpaceX to build the next crew capsule. And it succeeded. Boeing didn't get there yet, but SpaceX got there in 21 and brought the ability for America to put back people in space. We would still be relying on Russia at this point. But not only that, they took it from, by some account, about 10 to 50 times lower cost per seat, per trip, using fixed firm price contract than the space shuttle, and also a lot safer. So there's a good example, and it enables the next step for us, which is the destination, right? We've done the transport, and we can rely on it. Without what SpaceX offer, we could not even start Vast. And now we have to do the same for U.S. taxpayer and for expanding into commercial for the destination. But one thing I don't disagree is, of course, it'd be great to have more funding, more encouragement, and making sure we don't take risk with China. But it's also at an adequate level, at least in our piece of the industry.
Evan, what are your thoughts on this? I mean, I was talking to Beiju this morning about capitalism in space. We're talking about the commercialization of the space industry, and it does seem like the risk is, free markets don't necessarily have any fidelity to a particular country. The idea is that they're free markets for anyone to participate in. So how do we ensure that the space industry, continues to remain aligned in that way?
Yeah, and maybe I'll start by saying that I think the analogy that also is suitable here is aviation in the 1930s. In the 1930s, there were three things that were happening that really propelled aviation. The first is lessons coming out of World War I and the value of air systems to military outcomes, military applications. The second was the maturation of flight sciences, and the third was geopolitical pressure for the United States to become involved in the affairs of Europe and Asia. And during that period, you saw really what I call this Cambrian explosion of air superiority systems. You had purpose-built capabilities that were designed to implement operational concepts and doctrine. So strategic daylight bombing yielded high-altitude bombing capabilities, B-19, B-24, B-29, and then those had to be escorted by systems that had the compression capabilities of the Merlin engine. Then came the P-51, and then you had all these sort of escort capabilities, and those needed to be supported. You need ground infrastructure. So you had this kind of like massive evolutionary dynamic that happened to create these specialized platforms. And I think what we're seeing industry have to contend with is the Toyota Corolla model versus the sort of like specialization model, and we can maybe talk about that later. But I think like from what that did in the 30s was actually to operationalize industry in a really compelling way. Now that was top-down, government sort of state capitalism type approach, which I think worked, and it works in certain dynamics where you have massive political pressure. I think Silicon Valley has largely has become an unreliable partner to national interest. Look no further than Google's inability to like deal with their own workforce when it came to bringing Project Maven into the fore. And so I think you're starting to see some entrepreneurs, you're starting to see voices like Alex Karp, right? I mean, the book that he just released really deals with this issue, deals with the idea of motivated, patriotic founders at the helm of companies that are trying to make major disruptions, working alongside politicians and leaders in the Pentagon, and like that's the way to do it, right? It's the formula is well known. There's kind of no secret sauce to it. It's like, does your company have a mission? Is that led by a founder that can lead those outcomes? Do you have the capital backing, and do you have the relationships with the national interest? Do you understand the national interest in a meaningful way that's beyond just like financial outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, we were joking about this, I think, last night, but to some extent, the question is, which way Western man? Like, these are powerful technologies, and are we going to use them to, generate slop, or, in the case of artificial intelligence, or are we going to use them to promote human flourishing? And
well, like that requires, I think, the government to articulate a meaningful vision, right? I mean, this is, and I think to Max's point, like the emphasis on human spaceflight, the emphasis on humans being in space and competing with China, I think is creating the focus that's required for industry to come and co-invest alongside the DoD. So like that's there. I think we're recognizing that China's a serious threat. We need to take them very seriously. And if you're not paying attention to that, like, or if you don't take that seriously, you are just not paying attention to history. And so I think it works. I think there's a kind of an awakening that's happening right now that's very much in support of that. But it takes effort, and it takes constant engagement, and it takes drive, and it takes entrepreneurs.
But I think even with like launch, with a lot of people routinely call being solved, it doesn't at all address the rapid response that is necessary in order to reach things like Golden Dome or react to a bad day in space. I mean, we do have the Victus missions, which you're on, but even then, they're not quite that type of rapid response that you need. You need, if something happens, within 24 hours, you want something to actually go up. And the innovation and the push in those particular areas just is not necessarily the focus at this point, or if it is, there's just not enough innovation or money going into really how do we make that a reality.
I mean, to go to your point, I think we're just really lucky in the United States to be ahead of China in launch, but it's total luck that Elon was there and created SpaceX. If that had not occurred, China would be launching more mass than us. We right now, just SpaceX alone, launched 90% of the world's satellites en masse. So, to that point, if we had left it organic and without luck, most likely we would not be number one.
Well, actually, from a military perspective, China is ahead of the United States in launch. If you account for SpaceX, if you remove SpaceX launches for commercial purposes and for Starlink, China is putting more military mass to orbit than the United States is by like 3 or 4 times.
Bridget, do you have any thoughts on this, specifically this question of like pace? Like what is, could you, if you had to nail down maybe 1 or 2 constraints that are determining sort of the pace of the space industry, would it be regulatory? Would it be financial? Would it be political? Like, how do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with the panelists that I think the incentives need to be in place, from a resource perspective, and also from articulating a vision, as Evan mentioned, to have that be something that you can collaborate with private industry. I do think private industry has to have a vision, right? Like it's valuable that Elon did have that vision, but it has to kind of merge with the public interest and merge with the vision that's being dictated by U.S. government as well. And I think, to your point, Kelly, in terms of resources, it's like, these are really capital intensive projects, and so you need to have sustained resources that can help these companies actually go through the life cycle and development of achieving that. I do think like the new generation of startups that are moving faster and moving more efficiently with capital is also really important to show like, here's a vision of what we think we can do, and also look what we did in this time period and with this amount of resources. And that totally resets expectations too, which I think is really, really important, because we have to be efficient in that regard. I do think, like, to the public interest point, there's an interesting, what's the regulatory ecosystem with all of this, whether it's like the FAA or the FCC. There are a fair amount of guardrails in the space industry that kind of protect the public interest. I do think even historically it's been too much. It's inhibited the space industry from developing and innovating in ways that they should, and that's impacted kind of where we rank globally in terms of our innovation. So I think we're moving in a positive direction with that as well.
Yeah. It reminds me of I think earlier this year SpaceX was fairly outspoken about their perspective that the onerous FAA regulations were sort of slowing them down. And I know Stoke recently finished the environmental assessment in Florida, and that's a year ago. Yeah, and that's a big lift. I mean, what are your what's your experience with regulators, and do you have thoughts about space? Maybe not SpaceX in particular, but the launch industry's speed and ability to move quickly.
I have so many thoughts, but I'll
Yeah.
try and contain them. With launch specifically, one of the things and the trends that we're starting to see is that the U.S. is really not necessarily prepared to see an explosion in launch. We have this vision that we're going to be launching daily and reuse the rockets, and it's going to be routine. We're just going to keep doing it, very much like aircraft type operations. And when you're talking about that, the launch sites that we currently have and the regulations kind of surrounding them really aren't necessarily set up in order to be able to enable that. There's so many restrictions across the board, and it's really difficult and proving to be very almost impossible to find and put another launch site in the U.S. Then you have many different countries actually looking for captive launch. And so they are very excited to have launch companies go there, set up a spaceport, and really begin operations. And so I would say that I would really like to see the U.S. kind of recognize that and put a lot more effort into how do we really scale launch in the U.S. And make it so that we keep the launch companies here, and that we make kind of that routine launch a reality in the U.S. and not have it necessarily move offshore.
Mm-hmm. Max, I think one of the ways in which the commercial station is a different beast is the fact that it needs to be human rated, which adds so much extra care and attention, and there's a different risk profile there. So talk to me a little bit about that. Going through that with your partners at NASA, and where are you in the kind of design phase?
Yeah, right now we are in a race to launch the world's first commercial space station, Haven 1, next year. It's a single module space station. You can think of it as our MVP, minimum viable product space station, but it's still very complex and obviously has to be safe. We're lucky that we can rely on SpaceX for transportation, and the transportation is also responsible for emergency re-entries and emergency departure. And the Dragon spacecraft, which we use to bring a crew of 4 for 2 weeks and back home, has been human rated by NASA and is part of that program. So one of the ways to manage it is that piece. The other way is obviously our incredible experienced engineering team that have worked on many human spaceflight programs. In our contract with SpaceX. So SpaceX is actually working with us to integrate and dock Haven 1 with Dragon. Mm-hmm. And in that, they are adjudicating safety standards, safety reviews, and requirements they have. So they sort of act a little bit as our NASA for Haven 1. For Haven 2, which is our proposed successor to the ISS, so we have contracts with NASA to help us design Haven 1, but they are not the customer, they're not adjudicating. For Haven 2, which will be what, if we win the contract, which we expect to, we'll have the privilege to replace the ISS, then NASA is more involved in being an adjudicator in all of the requirements and so on. What we really hope, though, talking about commercial, is that they keep that involvement to users, how much power, payload, crew they want to have, and also they keep it to all the safety standards that they've built this amazing experience that they can pass to us, but they don't overreach into defining what we can do with sponsors and defining how we can use the station or who we can bring there when it's not their mission. So we'll have to see if they can keep that line as we hope, and it's critical for for commercial companies to succeed. But that Haven 2, which will be our NASA as an anchor customer, then we have them helping us from that point of view, the safety.
Yeah, how are you thinking about what to host and who to host? Like, are you thinking about we wouldn't allow certain countries in the same way that certain countries can't use the ISS? Different types of experiments that you would or would not allow? How is that evolving?
Well, firstly, the ISS is an incredible symbol and of basically international collaboration, but it also can be used by the United States as soft power. Who you invite, who you welcome, can be really a big tool of diplomacy. And there were, the original partners of the ISS are Japan, Europe, Canada, and the US. But since then, we've welcomed many more countries to come and visit the ISS. You know, in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, in Europe, countries like Poland, countries like Turkey. And so we expect that to continue, but we always are in the framework of US geopolitics, right? We're not going to invite somebody that is not in the good books of US leadership and geopolitics. And obviously there are some countries that, you know, pretty much the same countries we would not sell weapons to. We definitely should not be inviting to fly to Haven 1. And then in terms of the experiment and the private people, you know, we're not yet at the era of space tourism, you know, but we have, you know, 10 to 15% of our revenue expected from high net worth individuals that want to do important space mission and research and fly themselves there. But they consider themselves like professional astronauts, and when they're there, they're working on science, research, outreach, and all the same things professional astronauts will do. So obviously we have our brand, and we make sure that these people are qualified and also have the right reputation and so on before we agree to fly them. And then for payload, you know, we operate within the ground of the laws of the United States, but you know, there's obviously a lot of potential breakthrough in you know, doing stem cell human patches that eventually might be grafted on people and help cure cancer. And so there's obviously a lot of ethical questions sometimes in different activities you can do there. And you know, within the laws of the United States and then our brand, we believe we can make the right decision there as to what we enable.
I don't want to stay on this too long, but I do have to ask something, like with the way that NASA vets astronauts, there's incredible physical requirements, but there's also incredible sort of psychological requirements, and you have to be a relatively psychologically stable person to go to space for months at a time. How are you going to vet people? How are you going to make sure someone doesn't just lose it?
They've had, you know, in the history of NASA, things have come out of
yeah.
a few scary events where they were not sure whether somebody would open the hatch of the space shuttle,
Right.
which could open if you did it, and they had to put some restraining things to make sure it didn't happen. So we're lucky that actually SpaceX already started a huge pivot. So if you look at the NASA history, it has been, you know, you have to, any reason, you know, where you're not perfect physically or psychologically, you're going to not fly as a government, you know, NASA astronaut. SpaceX took the approach within their flight surgeon and their astronaut office and their, you know, how they deal with that, to basically try to fly, you know, everyone so long as it meets safety requirement. So the approach when somebody has an ailment or maybe is not perfect physically or could be disabled, for example, the approach is how could we technically, you know, with the flight surgeon, with the engineers, how can we make it safe and do everything possible to make it safe so that one day anyone can go to space. And so we're following down this footstep, which is more of a let's not try to find reason not to fly, but let's do everything we can to fly safely. And it's really important, as you know, today we have Dragon that is a pretty expensive platform to send people to space, and we can only send 4. But we have the hope of Crew Starship that will arrive. It's just a matter of when. Obviously, we'll take humanity to Mars, the Moon, and other places, but also we will be able to leverage, or we expect to leverage, to go to our space station. That will potentially bring maybe 10, 20, 30 people, 40 people every flight with a fully reusable rocket that is cheaper than Falcon 9. And so that will lower the cost, and then we will have the opportunity to send more people. Only 670 people have gone to orbital space to date. You know, I really hope that in my lifetime we will be in the thousands, and if not the tens of thousands. And we all want it to be millions, or eventually tens of millions. So we have to be open and flexible as to who fly but stay safe, basically.
Yeah, the minimum viable person, so to speak. Evan, you said earlier in the conversation something I found very interesting, that VC is becoming an unreliable partner, an unreliable capital
Silicon
partner.
Valley, not VC.
Silicon Valley. Okay. What did you mean by that?
I think there are generations of engineers that have been unleashed on problems that are really not for the national interest. I'm not the first person to make this argument, to be clear, but the focus, so the origin of Silicon Valley really was in the national interest, 1950s, 1960s. The exogenous factors that drove that really were the competition with the USSR, right? Coming out of World War II, competition with the USSR, that provided a level of clarity and focus that we had a strategic competitor that the United States had to be able to contend with. And you had a vision that was laid out, whether it was articulate or implied, to industry, and dollars going towards industry for big civilization scale projects. If you look at the defense spending as a function of GDP in the 1960s, 1970s, I mean, it was 9%, it came and went, but 9%, 7%, and in the last 2 decades, even with the so-called global war on terror, I mean, that was in the kind of 3 to 4%. So we are now waking up to a strategic competitor, really 2 strategic competitors across multiple fronts: Russia, a violent resurgent Russia, and China that sees American hegemony as a thing to dominate over the course of decades, and that it's a zero-sum game. And in the last 25 years, 30 years, the narrative that has come out of elites in Silicon Valley has really been, with the exception of a few, right, has really been internet-focused commerce, sales to individuals, dog walking apps, dating apps, finding ways to create casinos for the mind, right, mind-forged manacles, and the talent. The United States does not lack in talent. We don't lack in ingenuity. We don't lack in capital. It's a question of routing that capital and talent and capability and infrastructure towards civilization scale projects that are going to meaningfully propel humanity and meaningfully propel the United States on the political stage. So it's a really question of incentives.
Mm-hmm. It always is.
always is, yeah.
Okay, we're coming up on the end of time, so I wanted to ask one final question and have each of you answer, which is, if there's sort of one, if you ruled the world, and there was sort of one intervention you could make to accelerate space industry development, what would that be? What would be the most high leverage sort of change you could make? Max, I'll start with you.
I mean, I like the analogy to, in 10,000 years, I believe we will be multiplanetary, or we probably won't be around. Mm-hmm. And so we're right at the beginning, obviously, of the space industry, even though we obviously went on the moon quite a while ago. And I'm really lucky to be born here. And so if you really thought through that framework and you were the CEO of planet Earth, what percentage should one invest in making sure we are multiplanetary? And I would think you can't put 100%, obviously, and we have to also preserve the Earth. We have to feed ourselves. We have to entertain ourselves. But I would think it's probably in the single-digit percentage easily. One might even justify like 5%, but like let's say 1%
of the Earth's total.
If your future is to be multiplanetary, and you are going to have potentially terminating outcome with nuclear war or asteroids. Okay. One should invest a little bit over a long amount of time. Right? It might take hundreds of years. It might take 1,000 years to really stay there. Hopefully not. But the point is that even if you look at 1%, this is about 1,000 to 10,000 times more than the size of the global space industry. So I think we widely are underinvesting, and maybe we should crank it up to globally 0.1%, and that would be a responsible thing to do in my opinion. So.
I'm going to be quick in the interest of time, but I don't want to look too far out because I think we've got some immediate changes that we need to make, and so I would say I would like to see the change that Stoic is looking to do, which is the fully reusable launch and make it routine and make it like aircraft operations, as I said before.
Yeah, so I guess what we work on is ground segment. So we are the ground infrastructure that connects with various kinds of space missions, whether you're doing dynamic operations like what Evan's working on across different orbits, or wanting to launch from anywhere in the world, or wanting to have redundant and reliable connectivity with Earth for safe missions for humans actually being in space. And I think the thing that would be the most impactful for us is our business is governed by spectrum and various wireless mediums, whether it be spectrum or optical. And so I think we're also a global company because satellites orbit the Earth. Like if you're talking about a car driving along the freeway connecting with different cell towers, you need to have different locations around the Earth that can connect with spacecraft. And so harmonized regulatory standards for spectrum and other wireless mediums would be great.
That's a very good one.
You mean you don't want to allocate 5% of the world's effort to making life multiplanetary?
I mean, all the above.
One of the best examples of that I think where acquisition strategy has aligned the national interest with capital availability actually is in Golden Dome, particularly the Space-Based Interceptor program. There are companies that are over the next 3 to 4 years are going to invest billions into a program with the hope of demonstrating capability. It's very similar to what happened in commercial crew and commercial resupply, and we're doing that on a critical national, not we, True Anomaly, but we as a nation are doing this on a critical national security scale. There are other challenges like that where that acquisition strategy can be operationalized to bring capital along, prize type approaches. And so just choose a wicked hard problem and industry will be there to solve it as long as there's a pot of gold at the end of that rainbow. I think in-space nuclear propulsion is probably the next one. Chemical propulsion is just not enough now that we have like launch is getting solved, right, in the United States, reusable launch is getting solved largely. Now the question is like, okay, now what once you're there? And space is huge and it's gonna take lifetimes to get anywhere and we gotta shorten that to make it interesting.
I didn't know reusable launch was fully solved, but
It seems to be
I need to catch up with you after this to figure that out. But
All
I do like both of your answers. Those are good.
All right. Well, Max, Kelly, Bridget, Evan, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you
Thank
for
you.
having us.
Thanks.
Thank you.